The golden glow of the afternoon sun bathed the race course in a warm, ethereal light, casting long shadows over the gleaming white fences and meticulously manicured turf. The sound of cheering and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air, but Edward Sterling remained unmoved by the spectacle. He stood at the edge of the VIP box, leaning against the railing, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd with the precision of a man who had built an empire on observation and control. The crowd around him, dressed in the finest suits and gowns, had come to witness another race, but Edward had come for a different reason altogether. Helena, his 7-year-old daughter, sat quietly in the corner of the box, her legs crossed, her gaze fixed on the horses below. She was small, pale, with dark brown eyes that seemed too knowing for someone her age. Her soft, repetitive rocking motion and the way her fingers wove through the colorful ribbons she'd brought with her would have been dismissed as mere childhood quirks to anyone who didn't know her, except for Edward. He knew. She was his child, and his discomfort with her went far beyond her unconventional behavior. He had always resented her for that, for the way her sharp, unwavering observations disrupted his world, a world built on lies and manipulation. But on this day, it wasn't just her oddness that set him on edge. It was the way she was starting to piece things together. Edward didn't need her to see through his charades. She had been an embarrassment to him for too long, and now she was becoming a liability. Why is that man holding a paper and pointing at the brown horse? He looks nervous. Helena's voice cut through the chatter. A soft, innocent question that made Edward's heart skip a beat. He quickly averted his gaze, not wanting to make eye contact with her, feeling the weight of her words more than ever. His daughter's unnerving ability to notice details, to see what no one else could, was a curse in his world of secrets. Helena's focus had shifted to the horses in the paddock below. She didn't see the sea of high-end suits or hear the sophisticated conversations around her. She only saw the horses, strong, graceful, beautiful. To her, they were more than just animals bred for racing. They were the only creatures in the world that didn't try to hide their emotions. She knew them by name, by color, and by temperament. Every twitch of an ear, every nervous glance, every rapid breath. They spoke to her in a language she understood deeply. Edward clenched his fists, the growing unease in his chest gnawing at him. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She wasn't supposed to understand. She wasn't supposed to notice the way the money flowed, how the races were fixed, how he had built his empire on the backs of those horses. He had made a life out of deception, using his reputation and wealth to manipulate the system. But Helena was starting to see too much. She always had been different, but now she was starting to become a threat. "Don't look down there," Edward muttered through clenched teeth, his voice sharp. Helena's question had cut through him like a blade. The last thing he wanted was for her to understand what he was doing with the horses, with the money, with everything. But Helena didn't respond to his command. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance, the world around her fading away as she followed her own thoughts. "There's something wrong," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the din of the crowd. "The brown horse is scared, and that man, he's trying to make him do something." Edward's stomach turned. He turned his head slowly to see who she was referring to. Silas, the race judge. The man was indeed acting suspicious, holding a piece of paper with precise instructions about which horse would stumble on the final turn. It was all part of the plan, part of the carefully orchestrated race that had been rigged long before the horses even set foot on the track. Edward's grip on the railing tightened. The plan had been in place for months, the pieces carefully aligned. He had paid Silas, bribed the handlers, manipulated the jockeys, all to ensure that his horses would always come out on top. This race, like all the others, was fixed, but Helena was too perceptive for her own good. She didn't know the full story, but she was getting too close to the truth, and that scared him more than anything. "Helena," Edward's voice was low and warning, but the girl didn't flinch. She simply stared down at the horses below, her face soft but intense, as if the world's complexities made perfect sense to her in that moment. "Mommy says we should always tell the truth," Helena added matter-of-factly, her small voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Edward's blood ran cold. He hated how easily she could destroy his carefully crafted world with a single sentence. He glanced at Isabel, who was sitting beside Helena, her gaze distant and distracted, as she always seemed to be these days. Isabel hadn't fully acknowledged the danger of Helena's observations, but Edward knew that sooner or later she would have to face the truth about their daughter. And when she did, it would be too late. "Helena, I told you not to," Edward began, but his words faltered as his daughter's eyes met his with a clarity that sent a chill through him. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was a living archive of the world's uncomfortable truths, and she had a memory that could expose every secret he had worked so hard to bury. "I see everything," Helena said softly, almost to herself. "The horses are sad. The people are lying." The words struck Edward like a slap across the face. He glanced at Isabel, hoping she hadn't heard, but it was too late. Isabel was looking at Helena with that familiar, worried expression. Edward hated that look, because it was the look of a woman who knew too much and yet not enough. Isabel still believed in him, still clung to the belief that they could be a family, but Helena's innocence was forcing her to confront the darkness Edward had hidden for years. And the more Helena saw, the more she would ask, the more questions she would expose, and sooner or later someone would find out. "I'm going to take her back to the house," Edward muttered, his voice low and controlled, as if his daughter hadn't just shattered his carefully constructed world with her words. "We need to have a talk, alone." But Isabel's gaze remained fixed on Helena, her concern growing by the second. Helena looked up at her mother and gave a small, knowing smile, the kind that only someone who had seen too much could give. Helena wasn't just a child anymore. She was a mirror reflecting the darkness of her father's actions, and Edward knew that he couldn't keep her in the shadows for much longer. The mansion felt quieter than usual that afternoon, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Edward had ordered Helena to her room after their brief encounter at the race course. Isabel, now alone in the sprawling living room, couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to unravel. She had been married to Edward for over a decade, but the man she once knew seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a stranger she could barely recognize. As she poured herself a glass of wine, Isabel glanced over at the grand staircase, where Helena had disappeared moments earlier. It had been a long time since Helena had been anything less than perceptive, but today her observations felt sharper, as if the girl's ability to see things others couldn't had grown exponentially. Isabel swallowed the wine, her thoughts trailing back to the race earlier. Helena's comments had unsettled her. The horses are sad, the people are lying. There was something in her voice, a kind of quiet certainty that made Isabel's stomach turn. Helena had always been different, but lately she seemed to notice things that even Isabel hadn't fully grasped. Isabel couldn't help but feel that her daughter was seeing through the very fabric of their lives. The silence in the house was oppressive, but it was the sound of footsteps on the stairs that broke it. Carmen, the housekeeper, walked into the room, her expression unreadable as always. Isabel and Carmen had worked side by side for years, and while the two women had never spoken openly about the darker side of Edward's business, there was an understanding between them. Carmen had been a silent observer, a loyal servant who had witnessed more than anyone could imagine. Her watchful eyes had seen Edward's increasingly erratic behavior, his paranoia, and, most disturbingly, his dealings with people who were anything but reputable. Isabel couldn't help but wonder how much Carmen knew, and how much she suspected. "Isabel," Carmen began, her voice low, "Helena's been asking more questions today, hasn't she?" Isabel looked up at Carmen, surprised by the directness of the question. "Yes," she admitted, "and I don't know how to answer them. She saw something today, Carmen, something that scares me." She paused, her hand tightening around the wine glass. "She said the horses were sad, the people were lying." Isabel closed her eyes. "I don't know what to make of it." Carmen's brow furrowed, and she nodded slowly. "She's always been sensitive to things, to people. But what she's starting to see, Isabel, it's not just innocence anymore. She's beginning to understand more than we want her to." A chill ran down Isabel's spine. She had feared this moment would come, but now that it had arrived, she wasn't sure how to protect her daughter without facing Edward's wrath. "It's happening too fast," Isabel murmured, shaking her head. "Helena's been so quiet, so observant, but now she's seeing things she shouldn't be able to, and she's starting to ask questions, dangerous ones." Carmen hesitated before speaking again, her eyes darkening with a mixture of fear and something else, something deeper, more knowing. "Edward, he's been making deals, Isabel, deals that involve more than just racing." She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "You know that, don't you?" Isabel met Carmen's gaze, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" Carmen glanced toward the staircase, her voice dropping even lower. "There's been talk, things I've seen when I'm cleaning late at night, conversations in the study, the money, the names. There's more to it than what he tells you. He's involved with people who are dangerous, Isabel. It's not just horses anymore, it's corruption. And it's getting worse." Isabel's stomach churned. She had suspected for years that Edward's empire wasn't as clean as it appeared. But hearing Carmen confirm it, her suspicions now spilling out into the open, was like a slap to the face. "I don't want to believe it," Isabel admitted, her voice shaking. "But I can't ignore what's happening. Helena's not just a child. She's seeing things I can't see. And now she's noticing things about Edward, about the things he's involved in, things that—" She stopped herself, too afraid to speak the words aloud. The implications were too terrifying to confront. Carmen sighed, her eyes heavy with the weight of years spent in Edward's shadow. "I've been with this family for over a decade. I've seen him change. But what's happening now, it's different. Dangerous." Isabel looked at Carmen, her heart heavy with the truth she had been avoiding. "What do we do, Carmen? How do I protect Helena? Edward won't stop. I can't make him stop." Carmen's expression softened with sympathy. "You have to protect her from him, Isabel. You have to protect her from everything he's become. Before it's too late." Isabel didn't reply immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, lost in thought. She knew that the time for denial had passed. Her daughter's safety was at stake. Helena had always been an innocent observer, but she was starting to piece together a reality that Isabel had been too afraid to face. Helena had started to see Edward for what he was, and if she kept asking questions, if she kept uncovering the truth, there would be no stopping her. That night, after Helena had gone to bed, Isabel couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with the implications of everything that had been said. Helena's words echoed in her mind. "The horses are sad. The people are lying. She had always known on some level that her marriage was built on shaky ground. Edward was ambitious, ruthless, and driven, but she had never fully understood just how far he was willing to go to maintain his empire. And now, she realized, his dark dealings weren't just affecting the horses, they were coming for their family. And Helena was the one person who could bring it all crashing down. Edward Sterling paced nervously in his study, his fingers rhythmically tapping on the mahogany desk. His mind was swirling, the pieces of his empire slipping out of his grasp like grains of sand. The race course had been a failure. His carefully laid plans had been noticed by his daughter, Helena. Helena. A child who had always been too quiet, too observant, and far too honest for his liking. Her innocence had long been a source of amusement, but now it was becoming a liability. He couldn't afford to let her see too much, to understand too much. He couldn't afford to let anyone question his authority, least of all his own daughter. The truth about the corruption he'd woven into his business, the bribes, the rigged races, the manipulation, it had all begun to feel like it was unraveling. And Helena, with her uncanny ability to notice the smallest details, was the last thing standing between him and the complete collapse of everything he had built. Edward clenched his fists. He had always been a man of control, someone who had always played the game to win, but this was different. This was no longer about racehorses or money. It was about power, about survival. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He turned sharply, annoyance flickering across his face. It was Isabel, of course. "Come in," he said, his voice tight with frustration. Isabel stepped into the room, her presence always calm and composed, but today there was something about her that seemed different. Her eyes were guarded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Edward," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Helena's been asking questions again. Questions about the horses, about what's been going on." Edward stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of questions?" "She's starting to connect things, Edward. I think she knows something." He took a step toward her, his gaze intense. "What do you mean she knows something?" Isabel hesitated, but she stood her ground. She mentioned that the horses are sad, and that some people are lying. "Edward, I don't know what she's seeing, but it's more than just innocent curiosity. I think she's starting to understand what's been happening." A wave of unease washed over him, and for the first time in a long while, Edward felt a flicker of doubt. He had always underestimated Helena's perception, always dismissed her questions as childish musings. But now it seemed those musings were pointing to something far darker than he could have imagined. "Helena is just a child," he muttered, more to himself than to Isabel. "She doesn't understand anything." But Isabel wasn't convinced. "She's been different lately, you know that, and I'm afraid—" Edward raised a hand, cutting her off. "She's not going to ruin everything. Don't worry, I'll handle it." His voice was cold, detached, the mask of control slipping back into place. Isabel looked at him, her heart heavy with fear. How are you going to handle it, Edward? We can't just keep ignoring this." He leaned forward, his face hardening. "You don't understand, Isabel. You have no idea what's at stake here. I've worked my entire life to build this empire, and I won't let a child, no matter how perceptive, stand in my way." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. She could see the anger flickering in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen before. Desperation. Edward was more than just angry. He was terrified. Helena had become a threat, and he would do anything to eliminate that threat. "I need to think," Edward muttered, turning away from her and walking toward the window. Isabel stood in the doorway for a moment, her heart heavy with dread, before she turned and left, her mind racing with worry for their daughter. Upstairs, in the solitude of her room, Helena sat on the floor, her fingers moving slowly through a collection of small objects she had gathered throughout the day. She had always found comfort in repetitive motions, in organizing things, but today her thoughts were far from calm. Helena's extraordinary memory had always been a gift, but now it felt like a curse. She could remember everything, every conversation, every detail. And today, those details were starting to come together in ways that made her feel uneasy. She remembered her father's conversations, the ones he had whispered late at night. The numbers, the names, the way he spoke about the horses, the way they were treated like pawns in a game. Helena didn't fully understand all of it, but she knew enough to feel the weight of it. And it made her heart ache. She closed her eyes, the image of Wild Fury's wild eyes flashing in her mind. She had always loved horses, their grace and power. But there was something different about Wild Fury. He wasn't just another horse. He was a creature in pain, a creature who had been manipulated, just like the people in her life. Helena shuddered, pulling her knees to her chest. She wished she could talk to someone, anyone, but she couldn't. It wasn't just that she didn't know how to explain what she was seeing. It was that no one would understand. Edward wouldn't understand. Isabel didn't understand. No one could see what she saw, but she wasn't going to ignore it. She couldn't. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Helena," came the familiar voice of Carmen, their housekeeper. "Can I come in?" Helena didn't respond at first, but after a moment she nodded, and Carmen stepped into the room. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Carmen asked, sitting down beside her. Helena didn't speak at first, her eyes focused on the floor. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "The horses are sad, Carmen." Carmen's eyes softened with understanding, and she placed a gentle hand on Helena's shoulder. "I know, sweet girl, I know." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them settling like a heavy weight in the room. Helena's mind raced with everything she had seen, everything she had learned. "I don't know what to do," Helena murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to make it stop." Carmen looked at her with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Sometimes, little one, the best thing we can do is tell the truth. You know that, don't you?" Helena nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what that truth would do, but she knew it was the only way. The only way to stop the lies, the only way to stop the pain. The days passed in a blur, the tension in the house mounting with each passing hour. Edward's paranoia was growing, and Isabel's worry was mounting. Helena's questions continued, but they were no longer innocent. They were calculated, probing, and Edward could feel it. He knew that it was only a matter of time before his daughter uncovered the truth. But he wasn't ready to let that happen, not yet. As the Spring Classic drew closer, Edward's plans solidified. The race, the grand event, was the perfect opportunity. Helena would be in the crowd, just another spectator, but to him she would be the perfect target. And that was when the storm would truly begin. The morning of the Spring Classic arrived, cloaked in tension. The Sterling estate, usually buzzing with the excitement of race day, was oddly hushed. Even the horses seemed to sense the unrest in the air. Wild Fury, the dark bay stallion Edward had pinned his hopes, and something darker on, was restless in his stall, ears flicking back, eyes wide and uneasy. Edward stood at the edge of the paddock, watching the horse with a strange intensity. His plan was simple. Wild Fury, known for his unpredictable temper, would be positioned so close to Helena during the pre-race walkthrough that a sudden accident would be blamed on the animal. No one would suspect anything more. Not when Wild Fury had a reputation. Not when Helena was known for wandering too close. He clenched his jaw, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He couldn't afford hesitation. If Helena kept talking, kept remembering, everything would crumble. The deals, the money, the empire he had sacrificed so much for. Upstairs, Isabel was tying Helena's hair into a neat braid. The little girl sat calmly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress, eyes locked on the sunlight pouring through the window. "Mom," she said softly, "why is Daddy so scared?" Isabel's hand paused mid-braid. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He keeps looking at Wild Fury like he's a plan. Helena looked up, her gaze unsettlingly direct. Something bad's going to happen today. Isabel's heart dropped. She had barely slept in days. Edward's behavior had become increasingly erratic, more controlling, more secretive. Carmen had seen Edward meeting with a man in a leather jacket late the previous night by the stables. Cash had exchanged hands. The name Wild Fury had been mentioned. Isabel knelt in front of Helena, cupping her daughter's face. "Listen to me, baby. You stay close to me today. Don't wander off, not for any reason. Do you understand?" Helena nodded. "Are we in trouble?" Isabel forced a smile. "No, honey, we're just being smart." Downstairs, Carmen waited in the foyer. Car keys clutched tightly in her hand. She had already packed a bag with essentials, tucked away in the trunk of her old Ford sedan. If things went south, she was ready to run, with Isabel and Helena. She had kept her silence for too long, watching Edward cross line after line. But this was different. This was unforgivable. As they arrived at the track, the energy of the crowd pulsed through the air. Cheers, chatter, the shuffle of hooves. Edward slipped away the moment they entered, claiming sponsor obligations. But Isabel watched him disappear toward the stable area, her stomach turning. Helena, despite the excitement around her, remained quiet. She was scanning, observing, like always. Her eyes locked on a man in a black ball cap, whispering to one of the stable hands near Wild Fury's stall. "Mom," she said suddenly, tugging Isabel's sleeve. "That man. He was in Daddy's study last week. He smells like oil and smoke." Isabel's breath caught. "You're sure?" she asked, crouching low. Helena nodded. "He gave Daddy a folder. I remember the numbers on the front. Sabayeg Samsibgu, Shilbek Polsibil." Isabel's blood went cold. She had seen those numbers, scribbled in Edward's ledger. It wasn't just betting. It was race-fixing, bribes. And now this man was here, near her daughter. Isabel turned sharply to Carmen, who had been following closely behind. "He's doing it today," she whispered. "He's going to use Wild Fury to hurt her." Carmen's eyes narrowed. "We have to get Helena out, now." But it was too late. A track official approached them smiling. "Mrs. Sterling, we'd love to have young Helena come meet Wild Fury before the race. It would be great for the cameras, family image and all." Isabel froze. She's not comfortable around horses today. Edward appeared out of nowhere, slipping his arm around Isabel's waist, a smile frozen on his face. "Of course she is," he said through gritted teeth. "It's tradition, darling. Our daughter and our star stallion. What better photo opportunity?" Helena stepped behind Isabel, her body tense. Carmen moved closer, shielding Helena. "We need to leave," she said, low and firm. "Right now." Edward's mask cracked for the briefest moment. "Don't make a scene," he hissed. "You don't want to regret that." Isabel looked him square in the eyes. You already gave me enough regrets for a lifetime." And then, Helena did the unthinkable. She walked forward, stood in front of the track official, and said in a clear voice, "My daddy wants Wild Fury to hurt me." He paid the man in the black cap. He said, "If I'm gone, nobody will find out about the bad money." The words sliced through the noise like a blade. The crowd quieted. People turned. Cameras snapped. The track official blinked. "What? What did she just say?" Edward lunged. "She's confused. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Carmen was already stepping between him and Helena, hand on the girl's shoulder. "She's not confused," Carmen said, voice calm and certain. "She remembers everything, and I've got proof." She pulled out a flash drive from her coat pocket. "Audio recordings, financial ledgers. You might want to call the authorities." Security swarmed. Edward shouted, raged, tried to fight, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The cameras had caught the outburst. Witnesses were already talking. Helena stood quietly, watching it all unfold, eyes solemn. Isabel pulled her close, whispering, "You were so brave, baby." Helena looked up. "I didn't want the horses to be sad anymore." And for the first time in weeks, Isabel let herself cry. The next few days unfolded like a storm. Edward Sterling's world, built on lies, money, and manipulation, began to disintegrate. The arrest, though shocking, was only the beginning. The details that Helena had remembered, the evidence Carmen had painstakingly collected over the years, and the truth Isabel had kept buried for so long. Everything had come to light in a single, devastating moment. By the time the federal agents arrived at the Sterling estate, Edward had already been detained, his hands shackled in cold iron. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now seemed empty. Its grand hallways too silent, the expensive paintings on the walls only reminding Isabel of the man she had loved, but who had never really been hers. It was a Thursday morning when the first of many news reports broke. The headlines screamed the news. Wealthy businessmen had arrested for corruption and animal cruelty. Isabel sat at the kitchen table, the soft clink of her coffee cup the only sound in the otherwise quiet house. Helena, ever observant, sat beside her, her gaze fixed on her mother. "Is Daddy going to go away forever?" Helena asked, her voice steady, but her eyes searching Isabel's face for an answer. Isabel swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, baby, he's going away. But it's okay, it's over now." She tried to smile, though it was hard. After everything Edward had done, everything he had planned, she wasn't sure how to feel. She had known that what he was doing was wrong, but she had never imagined it would spiral into something so dark. She didn't have to imagine any more. Edward had been caught. The evidence was irrefutable. His manipulation of the races, the bribery, the threats, everything had been laid out for the authorities. And then there was the cruel plan to use Wild Fury to harm Helena, to take away the one thing that Edward could never control. His daughter's ability to remember, to observe, to speak the truth. The press conference, which would come later that afternoon, would be just as much about Helena as it was about Edward. As the press flooded the room, reporters bombarded Isabel with questions, their cameras flashing nonstop. They wanted to know about Edward, about the empire he had built, and how it all came crashing down. But above all, they wanted to know about the little girl who had brought him to justice. Helena, sitting by Isabel's side, had become the center of the story. It was her extraordinary memory, her uncanny ability to recall even the smallest of details, that had exposed Edward's carefully constructed life. In the midst of all the chaos, Helena remained calm, her focus unshaken. Isabel couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride in her daughter. For a girl who had always felt different, who had been treated as a problem by her own father, Helena was proving to the world that she was anything but a burden. As the days passed, the investigation into Edward's empire deepened. Federal agents had worked tirelessly, tracking down every connection, every secret deal he had made. And one by one, the names of those involved in his criminal network were brought to light. Judges, lawyers, and even veterinarians, all complicit in the corruption that had tainted the racing industry. Isabel's thoughts were scattered, consumed by the whirlwind of her own emotions. She was angry at Edward, but she was also heartbroken. He had been her husband. He had been the father of her child, and yet his true nature had been hidden behind a facade of charm and wealth. She had never known how deep his darkness ran. How could she have been so blind? It was late in the evening when Isabel finally found herself alone in the study, sitting at the desk that had once been shared with Edward. The room, with its dark mahogany bookshelves and heavy curtains, felt empty now. She reached for the file on the corner of the desk, a pile of documents that had been left untouched for years. It was one of the few things Edward had never gotten around to hiding: his record of debts, bribes, and illegal transactions. Isabel sifted through the papers, her hands shaking slightly as she read the names, the amounts, the dates. She couldn't escape the weight of the realization that every moment of their life together had been a lie. The vacations, the dinners, the plans for their future. It had all been built on blood money, on the suffering of innocent animals and people. But there was something more in the file. A letter, folded neatly and addressed to Helena. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. She opened it cautiously, the words etched in familiar handwriting that she had come to recognize over the years. But this was different. The tone was less calculated, less controlled. Helena, if you're reading this, it means the worst has happened. I never wanted you to find out what I was doing. But the truth always comes out, doesn't it? I'm sorry, Helena. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for everything I've done. But you need to know that the world is much bigger than what you've seen. Don't let anyone tell you that your differences are a weakness. They're your strength. They always have been. I love you, but I don't know if I ever really understood you. Edward. Isabel couldn't hold back the tears that welled in her eyes. She let them fall freely, the sadness of it all crushing her chest. Edward's words were empty, but they carried a weight she couldn't ignore. After everything he had done, his final confession felt like nothing more than a desperate plea for redemption. But there would be no redemption for him, not after what he had done. That night, Isabel sat with Helena, the weight of their new reality settling over them. Helena, as always, was quiet, her mind working through the details in her own way. Isabel wasn't sure how to explain everything to her daughter. How could she put into words the enormity of what they were facing? How could she explain the loss of a father who had never been there? "I'm proud of you, Helena," Isabel said softly, her voice breaking as she stroked her daughter's hair. "You're so brave." Helena looked up at her, her big brown eyes filled with clarity. "I just wanted to help the horses." Isabel smiled, though her heart ached. "You did, sweetheart. You did more than that. You saved us." And in that moment, Isabel realized that no matter what happened to Edward, no matter what the world thought of them, they had each other. And that was enough.